Ulug' Rabbim icabet kıl, Yirakta ana duasını. Ulug' Rabbim icabet kıl, Zindanda ata duasını. Ulug' Rabbim icabet kıl, Musafir yitim duasını. Ulug' Rabbim icabet kıl, Vatansiz g'arib duasını. Ulug' Rabbim nasib ayla, Ko'rishga vatan azodini. Ulug' Rabbim nasib ayla, Ko'rishga zolim zavolini. Ulug' Rabbim nasib ayla, Ko'rishga onam jamolini. Ulug' Rabbim nasib ayla, Suyishga vatan tuprog'ini. Ulug' Rabbim nasib ayla, Kezishga vatan gulbog'ini. Ulug' Rabbim nasib ayla, Vatan tuprog'ida o'lishni.
Assalamu alaikum, dear brothers and sisters, and welcome to a very special, a very important episode. As you've seen in the ad, I have a United Nations human rights lawyer with me, Emma Reilly. The topic for today is the UN selling out the Uyghurs. A United Nations whistleblower gives shocking revelation that the UN Human Rights Office secretly provides the Chinese government names of activists critical of the Communist Party of China and their atrocities. Emma Reilly, a UN employee who first found out about the practice in 2013, said one of the first issues she had was to deal with was a request from China to know whether specific individuals were planning to attend the session. I mean, I'm going to let her explain it. We've got some shocking revelations from an organizations that people like us, people like the Uyghurs and other oppressed people around the world are supposed to depend on, are supposed to be the voices for the oppressed. But we have them, aiding such regimes, in this case, China. I don't want to take up too much of your time. This sister, this woman, very brave, putting her job, putting her career on the line to join us, and, to spread this message that really needs to get out there. Miss Emma Reilly, I really appreciate your time today.
Thank you for having me. As you said, it's really important to get this out there.
I just want to get straight to it. But before I get right into it, I just want to find out a little bit more about you. And the reason why is, eventually we're going to find out what has led you to do what you're doing. And what you've mentioned to me off camera is that it's quite well known what's going on behind the closed doors of the United Nations, but very few, if any, I've only heard of one, and that's you, are speaking out in this manner. So I want to know who Emma Reilly is.
Well, I've basically been a human rights lawyer. Since my first degree was actually in maths, but then I did human rights law, and it was very specifically human rights law. I always wanted to work in human rights. Prior to joining the UN, I worked for a number of different NGOs. I specialized in particular in detention, inspecting prisons, trying to prevent torture in places of detention. And I worked on that for many years. Then I was regional director of an NGO in North Africa just before I joined the UN. And my background is very much in the non-profit sector. I deliberately avoided getting involved in kind of the more political aspects. But what I'd seen in my job was that when a UN employee said exactly the same thing that I just said to a government, the government would listen when the UN employee said it. So I figured, cut out the middleman, stop advocating for the UN to say things that are pro-human rights and start saying them on behalf of the UN myself. So yeah, I joined the office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, or the Human Rights Office, in 2012, and I was working on the Human Rights Council, and then it was decided that we were going to sort of change roles. So from February 2013, I was going to take over everything that was to do with NGOs that wanted to come to the council, those non-governmental organizations. And that's when I first discovered that this was going on. My first indication was an email that was forwarded to me from the Chinese delegation that went to a colleague.
So I just want you to break it down slowly. When we say this was going on, let's just imagine that, you know, you're talking about this for the first time. What was going on specifically?
The UN Human Rights Office was giving China advance information on who exactly was planning to come to speak out against China's human rights record at the UN in Geneva. And it was giving this information weeks in advance of the sessions. It is against every rule to hand this information over. There's written rules of the Human Rights Council. We had previously refused. I was aware of other governments that had asked for this information and had their request refused because of the danger in which it would place people. So when I saw this email, I assumed we were going to follow the rules. China wouldn't be given the information. But the email was phrased very strangely. It talked about doing a favor, but it also said as usual. So I objected really strongly. And all my colleagues gave the impression this was the very first time that China was asking. And we had all of this email back and forth. And it was only later that I realized that it had actually been going on before. I found one of the emails where names were transmitted to China in 2012. The UN now admits that this was going on since 2006, when the Human Rights Council was formed. So this has been going on since 2006. Hundreds of people within the UN have known this is happening. And I mean, can you think of a single good reason to give China that information?
So how many people, like, I don't know about the numbers, but do you know how many people or how many names were handed over in this fashion?
The ones that I've seen since 2013, or where I've seen China's responses, somewhere between 50 and 70 people in that period. From 2006 to 2013, I don't know, because it's really, I mean, the UN doesn't exactly copy me in these emails anymore. But we have a kind of central registry of communications with member states. So by going through that systematically, I've been able to find some of those communications since I started reporting it, and keep reporting it. I keep saying, look, all of the evidence is this is still happening and it needs to stop. And I have just kept reporting it, and the UN just keeps doing it.
All right, let's break it down further. When they're giving these names, okay, yeah, what is happening to those people, or to the families of those people? Like, really break it down, dumb it down for these people, so that, you know, something, I don't know, may happen. Because your story, I've looked it up, I've seen bits and pieces, but I'm thinking, why isn't it all plastered over mainstream? I'm talking The Guardian, New York Times. What's going on here? Let's really break it down. What does this mean? Because a lot of these activists, I know them, and they obviously, they've been advocating for the Uyghurs, and their names are out there anyway. But what's so special, or what's different in this case, the sort of platform that you're talking from?
Well, the UN Human Rights Council is the only platform, basically, in the world where an NGO can talk directly to the Chinese government. The Chinese diplomats are in the room. And often, you know, they object to people talking, they try to shut them down. You've no doubt seen all those videos where they try to interrupt any Uyghur activist that goes and speaks. But it's the only place, really, where people can speak directly to the Chinese government, and where the Chinese government can kind of at least partially be held to some kind of public account. So what happens is that a lot of those people would come to me and say, I was phoned by my family on a mobile phone number that they do not have, telling me not to come here. They would report to me that family members were being arrested just before the council session, that they were being taken into detention just before the council session. And it's that kind of intimidation that we were seeing. And still, the UN refused to stop doing this. It's, you know, yes, when people speak out, they know there might be sort of consequences afterwards, and people are taking that heartbreaking decision that it's important that the world be aware of this. And they're making that decision. but they don't have the full information when they're making it. They do not expect that the UN is going to hand over their name weeks in advance of them doing anything. And that the Chinese government is going to get advance notice that they're planning to speak out. And that's just so incredibly dangerous.
I assume that you're not the only one that knows about this.
Yeah, I am not. There are
Why
many.
the silence? Or what are you gaining from this?
Absolutely nothing. Years of retaliation for trying to speak out about it. My job title is literally human rights officer at the United Nations. It would be wrong for me not to report this. I can't answer for my colleagues. I don't know why. I'm the only one that thought it was worth reporting. A lot of people, when I reported this to the senior management, their response is always political. I pointed out, well, there are rules. Human rights are legal. We're supposed to stand up for human rights. Those are legal rights. This is complicity. This is complicity. At the time, I argued it was complicity in arbitrary detention and torture. Now it's certainly complicity in genocide. And it's not a political issue. It's a legal issue. Should the UN Human Rights Office help China identify victims for genocide or not? It's that simple.
Surely there is this giving of names issue. Are there any other issues that the UN and China are working together? Are there any other sort of atrocities that you haven't talked about?
I have to say that I wouldn't be in a position to know that. I don't see the sort of more political communications between the UN and China. I know that I've personally been shocked about the failure of the UN as such to speak out. We've seen statements from some of the independent experts of the UN, but not from the UN itself. And another thing that really worries me is that a colleague did send to me, after seeing my previous interview, a document that shows that the names were also being handed over when Uyghur activists tried to interact with the expert bodies of the UN, which in a sense is even more dangerous because those bodies are going to be looking at the human rights record specifically of China and making recommendations specifically to China. Often those bodies are called treaty bodies. They kind of inspect how much you're respecting international law. They often have private meetings with NGOs sort of in the basements of hotels around Geneva. They don't even meet people in UN headquarters because it would be so dangerous for their names to be released. And again, the Secretariat appears to have been handing over names. And it's just stunning to me that not only is the organization saying nothing in the face of the biggest genocide since the one that led to the foundation of the UN, but it's also actively providing names. And the thing is, the UN has sometimes tried to say that these are, it's only high-profile activists. It isn't. There's like interns that are working for organizations. And there's also a diplomatic issue here because, as you know, China basically has a surveillance state. China isn't asking about Uyghurs who are still in China. They're asking about Uyghurs who are nationals and citizens of other countries. There are UK citizens, US citizens, Australian citizens, Canadian citizens. It's these people's names that are being handed over. And it's their family members in China that are placed at risk for that.
Do you know of any specific cases that really, that's still in mind today that of one specific case and then a Uyghur activist came up to you and, look, my father, my brother, and this happened. Do you have one specific case in mind that you could share with us?
There's only 2 of the names that were given that have ever been made public, so I don't want to put anyone in any further danger by making public their names.
No, not their names, just like someone through this.
At least 3 times, Uyghurs came up to me and said that they'd received those kinds of phone calls from their families, that the Chinese police had been around their houses, that their family members had been arrested. There are people whose their family members were among the first to be put into the camps. One of the people whose names was handed over repeatedly is Dolgan Issa, the president of the World Uyghur Congress. And it's very well known what's happened to his family. And of course, you can never draw a completely straight line between the UN handing over his name and all of that. But the UN has been handing over his name since 2006. So, again, why? Why assist this from happening? And it isn't just Uyghur names. When Gao Shisheng was in arbitrary detention and nobody knew where he was, and UN experts were asking where he was in 2012, the UN handed over his wife's name. He describes in his book being subjected to torture, and that part of the aim of that torture was to stop his family speaking out. He was in Chinese custody, being tortured. And the UN just thought, yeah, we'll tell China his wife's going to come and speak out about that.
I assume you have the incriminating evidence with you. You mentioned emails.
Yeah.
Have you tried to take this to the media outlets that I mentioned to you before?
Yeah. There was an investigative piece that was written by a Guardian journalist, and he was very upset that his editor killed it. One of the things that happens is that the UN has now 9 different on-the-record stories about what happened. So every time they're asked by a journalist, they tell a different story. Whatever they think will kill the article, they tell that story. So I mean, now I've started to summarize those when I have contact with journalists and say, okay, so in 2017, when this first went public, the UN put out a press release admitting it, but saying it wasn't a problem because nobody was placed in danger. And then a bit later, they say this never ever happened. Well, I have the emails. They even talk in their press release about China responding regarding the people it knows are coming. So they're clearly giving them the information. I have all of the written evidence. But I think it's very difficult for people to believe that an organization, I mean, it's called the UN Human Rights Office. People see it as the sort of the last hope, essentially. When all of the national mechanisms have failed, this is where you go. This is where you can speak out when you can't speak anywhere else. And it's supposed to be, as you said, the voice of the voiceless. It's supposed to be standing up for victims of human rights abuses, not subjecting people to more danger. And I think it's very difficult for people to believe that it's happening. The analogy I often make is it's kind of like when the first allegations of sex abuse against peacekeepers in the UN came out. Nobody reported on that either. And now it's more reported on. There's been a lot more evidence, there's a lot more people speaking out. But yeah, I think it's just difficult for people to believe. It was difficult for me to believe when I saw it happening as well.
How much influence does China have over the Human Rights Council? Because they've been voted in.
Yeah.
I understand that as now they sort of can dictate what is a human rights violation or not. They're obviously not going to be incriminating themselves. Mm-hmm. How much influence, how much pressure? You hear the term, the UN has been bought by China. How true is this?
In the parts that I could see, I never understood why this exception was being made. I mean, bought by implies exchange of money. I have no idea if that's true. Certainly, the political influence exercised by China is outsized. My boss, who was sort of ordering and handing over names, actually explicitly said in an email when he was justifying why this was going to be done that if we didn't give names to China, it would somehow exacerbate the Chinese mistrust of us. And I was like, well, is being trusted by China something that is a sort of very valued thing in the UN?
And when you say your boss, are you allowed to mention his name or no?
Eric Tistone.
And what's happened to him? He's not in jail?
He was promoted.
He was promoted?
Yeah.
I wonder why.
He was temporarily promoted for about 5 years, yeah.
Wow.
And he's still there.
So what's his position now?
He's the chief of the Human Rights Council.
Chief of Human Rights.
Every time that I tell the UN that this is happening, and I wish this weren't the case, literally their reaction is they send him the information and ask him if it's happening. And that's why there's 9 different stories. And it's like, I have tried repeatedly to tell people, right, all I have told the member states when I write to them and I say, here are the names of your nationals that were handed to China, do something. All I am asking for is an external, independent investigation. Because I know I'm telling the truth. So I just want there to be some external body that can come into the UN and look at this and stop it from happening again. And there's no movement to do that as far as I can tell.
Now, we're talking about names being handed over to China. And, you know, we've been campaigning for, I'm sure you've seen various Uyghur campaigns were like, you know, the UN has to go into China. The UN has to go into Turkestan and, you know, to investigate.
The body that they are calling for to go in is the UN Human Rights Office. That's why I'm trying to make so much noise, because I have seen the campaigns. And I am so concerned, because if it's the UN Human Rights Office going in there and they're still handing names to China, who's to say they're not going to tell China who they're planning to speak with when they get there? And what will China do to those people then? So it's incredibly concerning. The UN Human Rights Office is definitely compromised as regards the Human Rights Council. As I said, this weekend, someone sent me evidence that it probably is compromised as regards the expert bodies as well. There needs to be an investigation of this. I am deeply concerned at the idea of that same office that has been collaborating with China, essentially having a secret practice that applies only to China and no other member state, without telling the activists they're handing over their names, is suddenly going to be trusted with going and looking at the situation that's going on in the camps. I mean, I'm just deeply concerned about that.
Because it's literally what's going to happen is it's going to be checkmate, because we're calling on the UN independent investigation. They're going to do an independent investigation, hypothetically, and then they'll be like, for example, nothing's going on. Well, China's going to go, well, you've got your independent investigation. What's up now? So that's what really scares me.
I mean, it's certainly a possibility. I know that there is state influence sometimes on the content of reports. And, you know, I've seen sometimes there are meetings where there's a sort of verbatim record of what was said, and China will send corrections. So it's like we all pretend this didn't happen. And yeah, it's, as I said, I'm just really concerned, because I think there needs to be clarity as to what is currently going on. Are they still giving names over? All the evidence said yes, but have they stopped? And what is the policy? And transparency about what that policy currently is before there's any trust in the UN Human Rights Office as such going in. Now, of course, it could be experts that are named separately from the Human Rights Office, but they would still be supported by the Human Rights Office staff. And that's what's concerning, because the member states didn't know this was happening. They have set rules against this. This was done by the UN itself, giving names to China. The member states.
Yeah. So when you see images of Uyghurs protesting in front of the UN, what comes to your mind?
I think they're completely right to protest. I think that when there is, as I said, the largest genocide since the Nazis, I think people should be in the streets. I think the UN should be speaking out. I think it's a disgrace that they're not.
No, I understand that, but you've got this organization that's doing all this corruptive, sort of sinister actions, and you've got Uyghurs hoping, you know, believing in this organization. That's why they've gone over in their thousands. I mean, a couple of years ago, I remember almost 5,000 people protested in Belgium, if I'm not mistaken, on the streets of Belgium, going in front of the UN.
Yeah.
From that angle, what you know, like you see this and you go, oh, you know what, guys, you know, there's something, you know, what's going on in the background.
Yeah, I mean, I still hope the UN can change.
Yeah,
I think that it is vitally important that the people who are responsible for this be held accountable. I think that if the UN wants to have the faith of any human rights activist who wants to come and speak out, they have to actually investigate this, hold people accountable, and basically, take disciplinary action against the people who are responsible for this. They should not be entrusted with this kind of information. They should not be in those positions. They shouldn't be in a position where they can continue to place people in danger. And that's why, I mean, I met with Antonio Guterres in the diplomatic lounge at Geneva Airport in February, and I tried to get him to hold people accountable for this. And effectively, his response was a political one, that it was difficult. That he was finding himself attacked by the former High Commissioner for Human Rights, who I reported this to and who did nothing in the press for his silence in the Uyghur genocide. And therefore, it was difficult for him to act because it would be interpreted as a response to that. And I'm like, that's not a good enough reason.
So let's talk about your court case or how this works. You mentioned that you can't really sue the UN. So could you tell us the process from the beginning? What's going on with you?
Sure. I'm not able to sue the UN because, well, it has diplomatic immunity. Although if any US-based Uyghurs think their names might have been handed over, there is a potential under the Alien Tort Claims Act. But I'm not able to sue them for complicity in genocide. The only court that you can take the UN to is an internal employment tribunal. So I did that. And there was a judge who heard all three of my cases in June 2019. And he ruled in my favor in the first case. He said that the Secretary General didn't have the right to ignore his own rules and abuse of authority. And he gave the UN 30 days to tell me whether or not they would investigate one of the actions that was taken against me. As I said, I can only sue the UN for what they're doing to me in retaliation for my reports. I can't sue them for the content of my reports. My other two cases were heard by the same judge. That was in June 2019. The last case was heard on the 14th of June. It went to closing arguments. He was away writing his judgment. He had been shocked, and he had expressed his shock from the bench, because the UN argument in court is that it is unreasonable of me to believe that the principle of do no harm, that the principle of keeping information on human rights activists confidential, and that the principle of treating all member states equally and subjecting them all to the same rules could under any circumstances trump the mere possibility of a better political relationship between the UN Human Rights Office and China. And he had expressed from the bench that that was shocking. So it was relatively clear how that judge was going to rule. So on the 10th of July 2019, the UN had him removed from his post with no notice. It was announced to him by the registrar of the court that he no longer had a job and shouldn't come to work tomorrow, and that he no longer had a job from that moment, and so he should stop writing judgments in my case. The UN then reassigned my case to another judge. The previous judge, to his credit, was willing to testify to the fact that his removal constituted removal by a party to the case of a sitting judge. And the new judge refused to hear evidence in that regard.
It sounds like
she's
sounds like one of those banana republics, literally.
It very much is. Oh, they even rewrote rules after the first judgment, where they were told that they didn't have discretion as to whether or not to kind of open an investigation, and they had to tell me whether or not they were doing it. 4 months later, they literally rewrote UN policy in response to my case. And it used to be that where there's abuse of authority, so that would include things like complicity in genocide, the UN had to investigate where there were reasonable grounds to believe that that could have occurred. Now the policy is that the UN only has to open an investigation if the UN thinks that even if it were all proven true, they would hold the person responsible. Now, the UN only ever holds responsible drivers and cleaners. It never holds responsible senior staff members. So they've literally rewritten the rules. They've fired a judge. I mean, I have tried everything internally and externally to change this, and the only way it is going to change is with public pressure.
I mean, no disrespect to the African nations. We hear a lot of these things, like firing judges. So I'm going to break it down for the audience. Is that a judge was going to rule in favor of Miss Emma Reilly, and on the 11th hour, he was fired. And, rules were changed so that these sort of things don't happen ever again.
Yeah, but the thing you're trying to stop happening is anyone reporting it. And that's why I'm speaking out as well, because the judgment that was issued in my case, and you can look it up online, it's public. I mean, the rest of it is kind of wrong factually. Yeah. But she tries very hard to hide what she's actually talking about. But if you go to paragraph 45, she couldn't hide it when she was talking about my submissions to the court. So it does say that the judgment is about submitting information about human rights defenders to a member state. That member state is China. And the judgment basically says that nothing the ethics offices of the UN ever say can be challenged. So because the ethics offices of the UN had ruled previously that there was no reason for me to report this, because the principle of do no harm can be compromised to a better political relationship with China, and that is the UN's position in court. Because of that, that ruling means that it is wrong for any UN employee who sees this happening anywhere else to report it. That's what they've done. By ruling against me, they have made it so that any future employee that sees this kind of thing happening knows that they should not report it, because the UN has decided it's fine. And the UN court has upheld that. And I'm going to appeal, but I'm almost certain to lose. The UN staff have a chance of success on appeal of 2%. The UN Secretary General has a chance of success in appeal of 92%. So
we're talking about the UN court. We're not talking about Chinese Communist Party court. We're talking about the UN.
Similar, though. I do get your point. The stats are very similar. Yeah, it's the UN's internal courts. When you can appoint your own judges, you're pretty golden. When you can fire a judge at 24 hours notice, you're not really going to lose those important cases. And the judge kept saying they had never seen a case like this. And yeah, that's why they did it.
When you first pointed it out in 2013, you kept pushing it, and it's a losing situation. I talked to you off camera, and I thought, the pay at the United Nations must be really, really low. She probably wants to go into private practice, and she's trying to wriggle her way out. But
the opposite. No, the United Nations works on something called the non-primaire principle. And what that says basically is that it should always be more attractive to work for the UN than for the national civil service. So UN employees are paid more than the highest paid civil service. We have diplomatic immunity. We get better benefits than the best benefits of any civil service. I mean, it's kind of a golden handcuffs situation for many people, I think. If your kids are in private school and you've got private school paid for up to the age of 25, anywhere in the world, then, it can be difficult for people to speak out. As I said, my personal view is my job title is literally human rights officer. It is my job to report this. I was doing my job when I reported this. I am doing my job by reporting it externally when the UN has done nothing internally to fix it. And yeah, if the only way of changing this is to bring more and more public attention to it, then that's all I can do. I can just keep sending people the evidence and saying this needs to change.
So you've mentioned some of the people like Dolkan Isa, World Uyghur Congress, Uyghur Human Rights Project, all these organizations trying to give a speech, trying to talk at the UN. Is there any point?
I would like to think there is a point. One of the things that I had suggested at the time to some of the people whose names were on the list was that, next time, if you're wanting to come, don't apply for accreditation until the very last second. And I even said to them, if absolutely necessary, I will sign you in as a guest. Like, just tell the UN far in advance that you're planning to come. China's aim here is to shut down discussion. That's what China's aiming at. The UN shouldn't be helping them do that, but they are. But China is aiming for a situation where it is never faced with any criticism of its own human rights record in the Human Rights Council. That situation shouldn't be allowed to arise. The question is whether or not the activists want to make those speeches themselves, or whether they want to give the speech to someone else to make, or how, the question is how to make that information come out. I would hate to see a situation where me speaking publicly about this and trying to stop the UN from being complicit stops people from speaking out. It is vital that people speak out about an ongoing genocide, but it's just people should know the danger in which they might be placing themselves, and people should be able to assess that and be able to take decisions based on real information and not based on the UN constantly changing its story about whether or not this is ongoing. In 2017, they issued a press release in the present tense saying it's ongoing. Later on, some of them have claimed that it stopped in 2015. So why did you put out a press release in 2017 saying you're still doing it?
You've just used a big G word, genocide.
Yeah.
We've been trying to have governments label what's happening to the Uyghur genocide. You've labeled it a genocide.
Yeah.
How many
basis for that if you want to.
How many other people in your position, a human rights lawyer in the UN, think what's like, do you have a ballpark figure of how many, like a percentage of people who would label this a genocide?
I think 100% of human rights lawyers would.
100%.
It's very clear. I mean, especially with Adrian Zentz's research into the forced sterilization. One of the definitions of genocide is about attempting to stop reproduction within the group. So it's attempting to annihilate an ethnic group. And one of the recognized methods of doing that is stopping the group from having children. And that's happening. So I would find it very difficult for a human rights lawyer who's read the Genocide Convention to label it as anything else.
So the question has to come, I have to ask this question. I don't know why I should ask it. Why isn't the UN labeling it a genocide?
Because part of that would be a criminal process, and you don't want to sort of bias a criminal process in advance. So I think that if there was an indication that people might eventually end up in front of the International Criminal Court, then to some degree you'd have to be relatively careful in your language, because obviously if you're charging someone with genocide for their part in those actions, that might prevent some labeling. But yeah, as I said, it's relatively clear there's a set of concentration camps. People are being forcibly sterilized. There is a fairly clear effort to annihilate an ethnic group. So, I mean, I think that most people who are sort of looking in that direction would certainly label it in that way. Obviously, you know, I don't think it needs saying, but I'm obviously not representing the UN right this second when I'm speaking out against them. So, I mean, you know, it's not an official UN position, but certainly I would find it very difficult for a human rights lawyer to look at the evidence and not come to that conclusion.
The following question, you may answer it or not. It's totally up to you, and I totally understand if you don't want to. The atrocities that have been happening to the Uyghurs, not just to the Uyghurs, Tibetans, obviously, recently Mongolians, Chinese Christians, you know, especially for the Uyghurs, the need, because of almost 70 odd years of oppression, Uyghurs wanting to have an independent state in order for them to be truly free, because many Uyghurs are of the idea that without an independent state, you know, there may be a softening of Chinese policy, but this will happen again and again, because it's not just concentration camps. You had the Urumqi massacre and other atrocities. Is this talked about within UN? You know, so is this mentioned, or is it, these guys? If it is mentioned, or you know, this is separatism in state, it's not mentioned.
I mean, it's certainly the way that China justifies its requests is that these people are anti-China secessionists, and certainly to that degree, you know, as you know, in UN documents, we're required to refer to parts of territories by their kind of internationally recognized names, whatever our own views are. And, you know, answering questions as to my own views on that subject would be a very swift way of being fired. But it's, you know, that those are the reasons that are given within China's kind of rationalization as to why exceptions should be made for it, why it should be given as information. You know, those, to me, that doesn't justify breaking any rules. And I'm certainly not aware of much discussion within the UN about that issue. But again, the parts of the UN that I've recently worked in, I wouldn't have heard it. So I can't really say with any certainty.
All I can say is, like, you're someone, like in the Uyghur language, right? We have this word called Vijdan, and Vijdan means conscious. I mean, you're giving up so much, and you know, like we, you know, within Uyghur culture or Islamic culture, we reserve the right to call just anybody a sister, and I will call you my sister because, you know, you're my sister in humanity, and you are giving up so much, and like, I mean, you're no organization. I see you're not making any money from this. On the contrary, you're losing so much. And my message to you is for you to stay strong. I could see a movie 10 years down the track where you would be the victor, and I mean, it's just, I'm shocked, and I'm sure many people watching tonight, like today, are shocked.
Yeah, they should be. I mean, this is shocking, and honestly, any risk that I'm personally taking is tiny compared to what is happening to the people whose names are being handed over and their families. It is my job to speak out about this. And, I need to be able to look at myself in the mirror in the morning as well. This just should not be happening. And, in a sense, I really hope there isn't a movie. I hope that the outcome is that the UN stops doing this and I can go and quietly continue to do human rights. Anonymity in human rights can be quite an advantage. But yeah, I just wish that my reports had led to this stopping. I wish someone in the UN had listened and taken action. And I can only say that I'm really sorry that they haven't so far, and I will continue to push until they do.
My last question, what do you advise for someone like me or fellow activists from now on? How do we approach, if we approach the UN, or how do we go about, should we even go to the UN? I mean, we see organizations like the IPAC, Interparliamentary Alliance Against China. I mean, I had Luke de Pulford last week, and I asked him, one of the main reasons the IPAC was formed is because the UN wasn't doing the very job that IPAC's doing, kind of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you remember, China's one of the permanent 5 in the Security Council. Like, China has an outsized influence in that sense. No Secretary General will be re-elected without the support of China. I would say engage directly with the experts. When it comes to the human rights parts of the UN, the independent experts are genuinely independent.
Okay.
The people receiving the emails on their behalf are not necessarily independent. But if you go to the website and you kind of click far enough in, these people apply for the jobs and their CVs are published in their entirety, and they usually have their direct emails on there. So there are ways of trying to bypass the system and directly contact the expert that you're trying to get in touch with. They also tend to speak in meetings that are outside the UN. Try to approach them there. So try to get the independent experts to be commenting on things. If you're planning to come to the Human Rights Council, be aware that all evidence points to names still being handed over. So there's a couple of ways around that. You can apply at the last minute. Obviously, if you need a visa to enter Switzerland, that's a bit more difficult. Or you can try to find an NGO that will deliver the speech on your behalf. Bear in mind, the Human Rights Council itself is kind of theatre. I used to sit in the podium and I would have in front of me all of the speeches that are about to be given, and I would just be reading along with the delegates. So there's a sense to which it's just a scripted performance. And it might not kind of have the impact that people think it will. The expert bodies do tend to have quite some impact. The special rapporteurs have impact. So there are ways of trying to find those people's direct contact details. Google them, find those direct emails, and try to engage with people directly. But just be aware that if you're applying to come to a UN event, and China might be interested in you and they ask, then your name is likely to be handed over.
I know I said that was the last question, but with that, how you talked about it's all theatre, we see Western countries send a letter to the UN, like 20 odd countries saying they support the Uyghurs, and then 50 odd quote unquote Muslim countries support. Like, what's that? Do those letters carry any weight?
There's certainly political pressure. And I think kind of the background political pressure. But I think one of the more effective campaigns that I've seen certainly recently has been about, China rose to power through economics.
Yeah.
I've certainly told my friends that if they're buying any cotton and they aren't checking where it's from, then, we can't be friends anymore. And it's that kind of thing. It's like that sort of pressure, political pressure. China doesn't like being criticized in its human rights record. That's why it's asking for these people's names. It doesn't want the public criticism. So I think that kind of pressure can be relatively effective. I think the kind of individual démarche, sort of diplomatic approaches from different governments can be effective. I think we're finally beginning to see that with some of the sanctions being imposed. The US has really led the way, but I think we're beginning to see in Europe some more movement in that. So yeah, I mean, I think that there's a number of ways of campaigning that are outside the UN that are very effective. But as I said, what I would hate to happen is that there's no criticism of China in the Human Rights Council because I speak out about this, because that's exactly what China wants.
Thank you so much, Emma. I do want to speak to you after, just like for a minute. I'm going to close the show now. Thank you so much. Yeah, I really appreciate it. You've given us such insights to what happens behind closed doors, under the table, as they say. Thank you to our audience, guys. Make sure you get this out there. Share it amongst friends and family, within your networks. And wow, you're a blessing, Emma. Thank you so much.
If anyone wants sort of individualized advice as to whether or not their name might have been handed over, etc., if you contact me on Twitter, I will give you my Proton mail, and you can contact me securely there.
Yes, I'm going to quickly, just give me a second to share your actually, I've tagged you guys. Okay, so if you go into, if you're watching this, in the description, I've tagged her on Twitter as well. But just for video's sake, just in case this gets downloaded off, where was it again? I'll just quickly do that. Here we are. I'll just quickly share that with everybody.
Yeah, it's at Emma Reilly tweet.
Yep. Here we go. Here we are. So guys, that's her profile. Make sure you follow her, message her. She's got her DMs opened. Yeah. And yeah, for all our Uyghur brothers and sisters and anybody else. Thank you so much. And stay strong. That's all I can say.
Thank you.
Okay. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.